Hey everybody. So this little lesson on federal, state, and concurrent or shared powers didn't go so well last week. So we are going to revisit the lesson and try it again and hope that you pick up a little bit more than I was able to give you last time. So here we go. So federal powers are powers that are held only by the federal or national government in Washington, D.C. These powers are enumerated in the Constitution, and they're not available to the states. So let's talk about what those powers are. The key federal powers, things that only the federal government can do, are kind of obvious, like declaring war. We don't want New Jersey declaring war against France because all the states must be willing to fight together, and so they have to act as a united states. We also know that individual states can't make treaties with other countries because any kind of a treaty, like a peace or a trade treaty, is going to apply to all states, and so all states have to be on board. A lot of you said that post offices were a state power. However, if you think about it, if I want to mail a letter to my cousin in Missouri, it's going to have to go through several other states, and so it makes sense that the post office is a federal power. Printing money, you may recall that under the Articles of Confederation, every state in the original 13 had its own money, and that was a disaster. Nobody knew how much the money was worth and had trouble trading, and so a common currency is a federal power. And finally, establishing a single army and a single navy, and today a single air force, is a federal power because we all have to rely on that one fighting force. Now, state militias are a little bit different, and those are established by the states themselves. But our U.S. Army and our U.S. Navy and our U.S. Air Force are run by the federal government. These actions involve all the states, and they serve all the states. Now, state powers are also referred to as reserved powers because Amendment 10 states that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states. Therefore, except powers that are expressly given to the federal government in Articles 1 through 6, or denied to the states in Article 1, Section 10, states are allowed to make whatever other laws suit them. And we know that Patrick Henry would be thrilled about this, to think that states retained a fair amount of power. Some powers that are reserved to the states are establishing public schools. Now, this was not originally outlined in the Constitution in 1791 because public schools weren't common across all states. And so once they did develop, the states took on the power to regulate them themselves. And so we have MCAS, standardized testing just for Massachusetts, which is different than standardized testing in other states. We know that professions like doctors, lawyers, and teachers get licensed by state because they have different rules and standards based upon what their state allows. Marriage licenses as well came up after the original Constitution was created, and so ages and requirements for legal marriage are set by states. These powers are held by the states exclusively, taken according to their rights, which are granted in Amendment 10. Finally, many powers are shared by both the federal and the state governments, and they are used at the same time, and so they're called concurrent powers. Powers that both levels of government can do, each in its own way. And so the question that you have to ask yourself for a concurrent power is, does this power exist for both the federal and the state governments? There are so many things that both the federal government and the state government can do. For example, elections. We have federal elections for senators and president, and then we have state elections for state senators and governor. Each level has its own laws, and so each level must enforce its own laws, like murder at the federal level and speed limits at the state level. If I break a speed limit, I might be called into a state court to talk about it, to plead guilty or not guilty, and to get punished. However, if I commit a federal crime like murder, I'll be going to a federal court because it's a federal law. And so establishing courts is another concurrent power. Sadly, everybody can charge and borrow money. The United States government borrows money from other countries. We're in deep debt to China in trying to eradicate our own national debt. State governments can also borrow money from the United States government for things that hit their state in particular, like a hurricane, for example. Taxes can be charged by both the federal and state governments. My federal taxes go for things that are going to protect the country as a whole, like a border wall, according to President Trump, or like a school lunch program that Charlie Baker thinks might be valuable for everybody. Finally, roads and parks are concurrent or shared powers because building roads sometimes exists within a state, intrastate roads or highways, and sometimes they go from one state to another, like interstate highways, like Route 1. It goes all the way from Maine down to Florida. And parks can be both national, like Yellowstone, or state parks, like Elm Bank. The tricky one in all of this is adding an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Primarily a federal power, this process starts in the federal government. Typically, it is 2/3 of both the Senate and 2/3 of the House of Representatives that must agree to offer an amendment to be added to the Constitution. Once it's discussed and the wording is established, the proposed amendment goes to state legislatures, and 3/4 of all state legislatures must ratify the amendment before it's added to the Constitution. Thus, 38 states have to say, let's change the Constitution, which has only happened altogether 27 times. But the first 10 amendments were the Bill of Rights, and so really only 18 times in history. It's quite rare. So just to review, powers are distributed. Sometimes the federal government has the power exclusively. Sometimes the state government controls the issue. And sometimes they can each do it at the same time. And so our best example of a federal power is a declaration of war. We don't want the states doing that on their own. The best example of states' powers is regulating public schools, managing all different issues like when school starts at the beginning of the year, what time of year it ends, is too difficult to set up for the whole country. And finally, everybody gets to charge you taxes because the federal government has its own projects that it wants to fund, and the state government has other ones. I hope this is clearer to you now. The next thing you'll do is take a Socrative quiz, and we will find out. Good luck.